let's take a quick look at what the Book of Enoch is that I'm actually talking about. Now, there are actually, I'll be mentioning maybe a little bit more about this as we go on, but the Book of Enoch is an ancient text that we have, and I'll talk about where several of the copies are that we get them from. But there is this ancient text, and there are 5 books or 5 sections to one manuscript. Before I go into that, let me mention there are actually 3 books of Enoch. First Enoch, Second Enoch, and Third Enoch. Can be a little confusing. First Enoch is what we're really going to be talking about, because Second and Third Enoch were written after the time of Christ in the 2nd century and even later into the Middle Ages. So they're really not an ancient text, and one of them was a Gnostic text, and they're basically taking ideas from Enoch and rewriting stuff for themselves. So that's not really the ancient stuff that we're talking about, Second and Third Enoch, and those are in different languages. Second Enoch is in Slavonic, Third Enoch is in Hebrew, and that's Gnostic. So we're not talking about that. First Enoch is in Ethiopian, and that is the text that goes back to the more ancient of days. So there's those 3. So we're talking about First Enoch. So I'll say Enoch or First Enoch, that's what I mean. So there are 5 books or sections of First Enoch. Now, this was a series of texts that was written in the intertestamental period. What that means is, at the end of the Old Testament and before the beginning of the New Testament, there's this time period of about 300-400 years, right, where we don't have any scriptures. But there's all these texts that were written by the Jews, and this is one of them. Now, it may have been quoting and using sources from earlier than that, but what we have, this is what we believe, when we believe the text was ultimately written. Maybe it goes back to an older tradition, though, is my point, as many of the books in the Bible do. Now, the first book is called the Book of the Watch. So when I say books, realize that they call them books, but they're chapters in the Book of Enoch. So just beware, it's kind of like the Bible, right? You know, the books of the Bible, but they're really chapters if you're reading it. So the Book of the Watchers, this is chapters 1 through 36, and this is written probably around the 3rd century BC. This predates the Hellenistic period. Now, this is the most important, most relevant to our discussion, because this is the book that's quoted in the Bible and more than anything, but it's not the only one. Okay, but it is the most important because this tells the detailed story, this Book of the Watchers tells the detailed story of how 200 watchers fell from heaven, led by Semyaza and Azazel, the lead watchers at that time. They came down to Mount Hermon. There was 200 of them. They mated with human women, and giants were born from them. And then it talks about how these giants grew and became cannibalistic and were just consuming everything, and they became very violent and rageful. And it leads to the flood. So this is sort of like an extrapolation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, see? A lot more detail. It gives the names of a lot of the watchers. It talks about occultic secrets that they revealed to mankind, like they revealed the implements of war, or they revealed the cutting of roots and occultic magic and, all these kinds of evil things they revealed to mankind. And so the concept there is that mankind drew from this. It's not that mankind wasn't evil in and of himself, or they're not responsible, obviously, and we do have the Garden of Eden, but the point is that they revealed this material to them. And then Enoch has a vision where God tells him, go proclaim judgment to the watchers. He kind of has a vision, goes into heaven, goes down to Sheol and stuff like that. So that's kind of roughly what the Book of Watchers talks about. The second book is called the Book of Parables. That's chapters 37 through 71, and that was written probably one of our probably the latest texts. It was a lot of these texts were written at different time periods, but sort of ultimately edited together, in some way. This book recounts Enoch's cosmic journey and vision of judgment upon the fallen watchers. So there's a little bit of overlap, a little bit more detail, but it also talks about his cosmic journey through the heavens and in Sheol. And there's also a little bit about astronomical phenomena about where the source of the wind and rain comes from in that ancient worldview. But it has a unique contribution, and that is, there's a vision of God's throne. And we see the Ancient of Days that we're familiar with from Daniel 7 and Isaiah. It talks about the Ancient of Days, talks about the heavenly host, and it talks about the Son of Man as a vice regent, referred to as Messiah in this text. And this book was very influential on the New Testament concept of the Son of Man, which we'll talk about later. The third book, it's called the Book of the Heavenly Luminaries. This is chapters 72 through 82, probably written around the 3rd century BC. It has roots in the Persian period, around 500 to 300 BC. Anyway, this Book of the Heavenly Luminaries this is a weird one. It's a hard one to follow, but it talks about Uriel, the angel. You know, the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, but also there's Uriel as well, and a few others. Anyway, it talks about Uriel, the angel, showing astronomical, cosmological, and calendrical laws to Enoch that verify the solar calendar. So there's something going on there about this comparison of the solar calendar being superior to the lunar calendar. I don't know how that all fits together, but basically a lot of astronomy, cosmology, and calendar type related stuff. Very appealing to Jews of that time period, because in that time period, is around the Hellenistic time period where they're trying to maintain their Jewishness. Then we have the fourth, which is the Book of Dream Visions. This is chapters 83 through 90. This was probably written around the 2nd century BC, and this is a book that has 2 dreams of Enoch. The first one, the 2 dreams were told by Enoch to Methuselah, his son. Remember Methuselah, who lives to 969? This is when he's younger, before he gets married. He tells him these 2 dreams he has. The first one is about the flood. Again, a little bit more about the flood and the Watchers, just a little bit. Nothing necessarily new or unique there. And the other one is this long thing we call the animal apocalypse. Now, the animal apocalypse is called that because apocalyptic literature uses symbols to talk about history. And this is telling the history of the world from creation up to the present, but it uses animals as the allegory, so there's camels and it's real obvious what the animals represent, but that's basically what he's doing. He's telling the history of the world in terms of animals, and it goes all the way up to about the Maccabean revolt, which is around 165 BC, and that's why scholars think it was written around that time, because it ends there, right? So this is an apocalypse that's meant to encourage those Jews who are under persecution that God is in control. Then, lastly, we have the book of the Epistle of Enoch. This is chapters 91 through 107, and this is probably written around the 2nd century BC. And these are basic exhortations by Enoch to his children to be righteous. He predicts the woes of suffering, shame, misery, and judgment for the wicked who are rich and oppress the poor. Not just because they're rich, but they're oppressing the poor. But he also talks about how the righteous are oppressed by them, and these evil people worship idols. Then he predicts justice, comfort, eternal life, and glorification like the stars of heaven for those who remain pure. We're going to see a lot of this imagery later when I talk about the Bible itself. But there's an additional few appendices that are very interesting. So there's kind of 6 parts, but just let's leave it at the basic 5. There's an additional couple appendices added on at the end of the book. One of them is Noah's infancy narrative. And so it tells the story of how when Noah was born, he glowed and had white hair. And actually, Lamech, his father, thought he might have been a Nephilim, right? Because that's what the Nephilim were glowing beings. But he's ultimately reassured by the angels he's not. This is just because he's God's chosen one. Then there's also an exhortation by Enoch of judgment of good and evil at the end days, at the latter days. Then lastly, there's another element called the Book of Giants that's part of this appendices. And this is really interesting because we only have fragments of this, but this talks a little bit about the flood judgment and the giants of those days from the perspective of the giants, which is really unique and interesting, not in the rest of the Book of Enoch. There's names of giants and things they do. They get dreams from God, and they wonder what they are, and they go to Enoch and ask him, what does this mean? Very fascinating stuff. But previously, the Book of Giants was only known as a Manichaean Gnostic book of, I think written the 3rd century AD. Very Gnostic, not biblical at all. But with the discovery in the 50s of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments, they found fragments of the Book of Enoch, the original, more than likely the original, in Aramaic, and it doesn't have all that Gnostic elements to it. So that's really fascinating. So now some scholars think that Book of Giants should also be a part of the Enochic corpus, as we call it. So those are the 5 basic elements. Again, gives you a feel for it. Just taking this in context, Enoch and the canon,